Well, hello, welcome to the video. This one will be very short, hopefully, though you know I do ramble on a bit. Sorry about that. It's about who killed pub rock.
How it happened, who was there, how many got killed and who killed them. Changes depending on who's telling the story.
Now, I'm talking obviously about the movement in the United Kingdom, mainly in London, though it did spread throughout the whole of the country. And also it was a feature in Australia and New Zealand. I know that, but I'm talking about London in particular, where I was based. I was at the heart of the London pub rock scene. I contend there's always been music in London's pubs, going back to the days of the troubadours and music hall and the sing-alongs in the 1930s and 40s and skiffle and jazz in the 50s and rock in the 60s. In 1972, it sort of accelerated because people led by Dave Robinson consciously went out and they got more pubs to put on bands because there were bands available to play. That's the thing. Back in 1972, there were more bands probably than there were venues for them to play. It was a product of the 1960s of the Beatles, the Liverpool scene, the Rolling Stones, all those things. By 1972, there was a huge market not only to watch bands, but also to play in a band and to create your own, a do-it-yourself sort of thing. A bit like the punk explosion that came a few years later. There was a thriving college circuit and bands could exist just by playing on that. I'm going to include in this places like Dingwalls and the 100 Club, which weren't technically pubs, they were clubs, but it was the same ethos. In fact, many people thought of Dingwalls as being the home of the pub rock movement. And I'm not talking about pub rock as being a style of music, let's get that straight too. For me, pub rock was definitely not a style of music. None of the bands that played in London, apart from perhaps Ace and one or two more, could be defined as this pub rock genre of music. To me and to everyone else, especially at the time, pub rock was bands playing in pubs. And it stretched from reggae to folk and all kinds of things. It was very widestream and there were lots of people prepared to go and see it, and it was partly a reaction against big concert stadiums and rock bands that got more and more elaborate and started charging more and more money to see them in large venues. So pub rock was a way where you go and watch bands often for free, usually for 50 pence or something like that. Rather than pay £2 or £3 to see a big band in Earl's Court or something like that, you could pay 50 pence to see Dr. Feelgood, for example, in your local pub. And I'd say that was well worth it. And it boomed. It absolutely boomed. At this point, can I just say, before we go any further, if you're not already subscribed, it would be a great help to me if you could subscribe. And if you like this video, blah, 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 like it, share with your friends, please. Introduce me to your friends. I think we'll get on fine, don't you? And back to who killed pub rock.
Until then, remember, it isn't the car that kills, it's the driver.
The 1970s in particular was known as the glory days of pub rock, and a lot of people think that when bands like Ian Dury and the Blockheads and Elvis Costello and people like that left the pub for higher things, it was the end of pub rock. And it wasn't really. It's basically an economic thing, because the main reason people play in bands or make music is to make money. They start off wanting to make a living, which is great, and then if they do better and better and better, and people like obviously Elton John and David Bowie and the Beatles and people like that made millions, but most people earn a decent living. Now, those that don't, leave it and go and find something else. So that was part of it. It was like an economic thing, because the demise came because small venues, because most of these pubs held, I suppose, between 150 and 300. 300 was a big pub, although there were bigger pubs like the Nashville, which ran from I think about 1975 to 1978, held about 500 or 600, as did Dingwalls and places like that. And upstairs at the Clarendon, which I would say is a pub because it's the Clarendon Hotel at Hammersmith, no longer there of course, it's now the bus station. They were mainly quite small places, so the economic viability of it, if you're running a venue like that, you can't pay bands a huge amount. And as bands get more successful and more people want to go and watch them, they naturally leave playing in pubs. And that's partly why the pub rock thing went slightly wrong, and it's still going now, let's say that. There's still pubs with bands playing now, but It's a lot less than it was, say, in the 1980s. Back then, it was traditional for most pubs, or practically all pubs, to be owned by breweries. That meant that the pub in question only sold the beer from that brewery, and it might mean that if you have a big brewery, they would own tens of thousands of pubs, whereas smaller breweries will only own a few hundred pubs. And it basically meant that in the old days, you used to go into a town or a village and there'd be a Watney pub there or a Young's pub there, and you would only get one brand of beer in each pub. And Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, in 1989, decided that wasn't good enough. People wanted more choice, and it was backed by the likes of the Daily Mail, who were all for choice, and it would mean that prices would drop, blah, blah, blah. Breweries could only own a certain number of pubs, so what happened was the breweries just gave away or sold off their pubs to pub companies they'd formed, which basically meant that the pub company then had only one interest. When the breweries owned the pubs, they could charge low rents because obviously the pub was selling their beer and that's how they were making their money. Whereas if it was just a pub owning company, they had to charge higher rents. And that's what happened. All the rents went up. And in 1990, we had to leave the Cricketers because the rent doubled when it went from Grand Metropolitan, who were the brewery owning Watneys and Trumans and all that. And they formed a company called Intrapreneur, which basically wanted twice the rent. And so there's always somebody around who will pay larger rent. So that's what happened, and they went bankrupt. I think this was the main reason why there was a big shift in 1990, because after then, in the 1990s, the number of music pubs dropped hugely. People who owned pubs realised they could make more money by having a fancy restaurant or doing other things in there. In London, a lot of the pubs changed their music rooms into restaurants, and did the Half Moon at Putney. The company that owns that keep trying to change the music room into a restaurant, but they keep getting knocked back because there's a strong local feeling that it should remain a music venue, and rightly so, I think. So that was the next reason. So in the 1990s, you lost, I think, half the music pubs in the UK because of that economic factor. In the old days, I mean, back in the 1970s and 1980s, there were loads of bands who would play in pubs. They had record deals very often, and so it was a very healthy thing. There were less and less pubs every year from the 1990s onwards. And the final nail in the coffin, I think, for music in pubs and clubs was actually COVID, because by the time we got through the lockdown and people had decided to go out again, which not everybody did, it was all over really, because the venues I was working with, the Borderline and the Margaret Winter Gardens, had closed, and most of my audience had vanished. That's why I stopped, and my story is typical of many, I think. Plus, well, I'm actually quite old now. It's not an old man's game, even though throughout the time I was doing it, a lot of the most successful people were older than me and literally carried on till they dropped. So there you go. Well, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Please like, follow, etc. Subscribe and share it with your friends, and I'll see you next time. The algorithm thinks you're going to love this one, so prove it wrong, eh? Bye-bye.